can.
Okay.
Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am stunned to be joined by Dr. Brian Keating. So thanks for joining me, man.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So I trust you're recording it, so I don't have to record this time.
Yes, I've got that all sorted.
It's my nightmare to do a couple-hour interview, an hour interview, and then all of a sudden, I forgot to turn on the recorder, but it's happened to me. And actually, sometimes that's the only way you can tell if you're doing a good job. If you can tell that your guest wants to come back on to re-record the interview that you forgot to tape, to record the tape. But it's a pleasure to be with you, Josh. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, this is episode 263, I think. So I've had every possible thing go wrong so far. I've had video not work. I've had the worst audio ever. I learned a lot about what not to do when recording audio. I've been through the works.
We can compare notes.
Yeah, I'm sure. But I'd rather talk about physics and your book and all the cool things that you talk about on your podcast. So you're the host of the Into the Impossible podcast, author of Into the Impossible and Losing the Nobel Prize, which I have just started. I haven't unfortunately got very far because I've been deep in your interview with Eric Weinstein and Avi Loeb, where you talk about the UAP UFO phenomenon. So I'm sure we'll get to that because that fascinates me.
It's mandatory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, love the attitude. So the thing I wanted to start with was the thing that actually kind of surprised me about your book was the amount you spoke about imposter syndrome, and you asked all these brilliant physicists about imposter syndrome. It's not a question I would ever think to ask. So what prompted you to make that not a focus, but a central theme of the book?
Yeah, so it started off, my second book is called Think Like a Nobel Prize Winner, or Into the Impossible, Think Like a Nobel Prize Winner. And it was really precipitated by the fact that I have had the honor of interviewing 9 Nobel Prize winners at that time. Now it's close to 13 Nobel Prize winners, mostly from physics. So I'm trying to get branched out into other Nobel disciplines. I soon will have on an economist. I can ask him about inflation. And every guest that I interviewed that's done something of renown that brought him or her to my attention, I always ask my patented, what I call the thrilling 3 final questions. One of which is, kind of what would you do? What kind of advice would you give to your former self? I phrase it in the form of a quote from Sir Arthur C. Clarke, who is the namesake of Into the Impossible. He said at one point, the only way of determining the limits of what's possible is to venture beyond those limits into the impossible. And I turn that around and say, using that kind of motif, what would you advise your 20-year-old, it depends on how old they are, your 25-year-old self to do as you did, go into the impossible? And I did that for all my guests. And then one guest in particular, my friend Barry Barish, who won the Nobel Prize in 2017 for detecting gravitational waves from 2 black holes that danced around each other for millions of years, decided one day, 1 billion years ago, to crash into each other and create a super duper black hole, almost twice as massive as either one. Put together, but also release all this energy that suffuses the cosmos with a particular type of signal called gravitational radiation that he and his team detected in 2015. And I said to him, Barry, what advice would you give to yourself? He's in his 70s, late 70s at the time. And he said to kind of, overcome the imposter syndrome. But he said, I wouldn't tell myself just at age 25. I would tell myself now. And I was like, you got to be kidding me, man. You won the Nobel Prize. You're a professor at Caltech, very prestigious university. You've been the president of all these societies, and you won the Nobel Prize. And he said, no, Brian, when you win a Nobel Prize, something I may never do because I wrote a very critical book called Losing the Nobel Prize, my first book, is extremely critical of the Nobel Prizes, the science prizes in particular, but a little bit about the peace prizes as well. And that book, really cast me out of favor, not to mention the fact that when I was invited to nominate the winners of the Nobel Prize, I divulged that fact, which is a confidential breach of their confidentiality, but I explain why in that book. Anyway, Barry Barish, winner of the Nobel Prize, says, no, I have the imposter syndrome now worse than ever, because when you win a Nobel Prize, You go to Stockholm, you get your golden medal, which has a picture of Alfred Nobel on it. And, Barry was here. I stole his because he was foolish enough to bring his. No, this is a piece of chocolate that I got at the Nobel Museum in Sweden. But anyway, when you go there, you have to sign a book that says, I got this golden medal. Holding it up on video. And that golden medal comes with $1 million purse. And they want to make sure that you signed off on the release, that you're not going to come back and say, oh, where's my money? So he said, when you sign that book, they have the same book. It only has, 100. It's only been around for 116 years at that point. So it's a small book. And he couldn't resist being a curious character. And he looked back and he saw the names of the past. He saw Marie Curie. I have all these sock puppets in my office. There's Marie Curie. And he saw Richard Feynman. And he saw Paul Dirac. But his heart stopped and he felt incredibly unworthy when he saw this guy, Albert Einstein. I have a bobblehead of Albert Einstein here. And he said, I'm not worthy. I'm just not worthy of being in the same category. I'm just some guy from Nebraska, that grew up never really thought I'd amount to this. How can I be compared to the greatest human scientists ever? And I said, Barry, take comfort, because old Albert had his own imposter syndrome when it came to this guy, the United Kingdom's very own Isaac Newton, Sir Isaac Newton. I have a sock puppet of him as well, of course. But Newton, by the way, Barry, I said not only Newton, who Einstein called the greatest scientist ever, not only Newton was to be jealous of, but Newton himself had the imposter syndrome, because Newton was a deeply Christian man. And he believed he failed to live up to the ideals of Jesus Christ. So we all have our own kind of imposter syndromes, it turns out. And I like to think that gave Barry some comfort. He ended up writing the foreword, one of the two forewords. One is written by James Altucher, who's a famous podcaster here. The other one's written by Barry Barish, the winner of the 2017 Nobel Prize. And hopefully he has overcome this imposter syndrome. But I said to myself, if even these titanic intellects, the highest prize humanity gives, can feel this, so can you or I. And how do we overcome it? That's the topic of the book.
It's interesting. Like when you were talking about it, I wouldn't maybe put Chris Martin from Coldplay quite in the same category, but there's a quote from him that always sticks in my mind. He says that the greatest arsenal, or the greatest weapon in their arsenal, is worry. And do you think that there's any utility to that kind of self-doubt in any form?
I think there's a utility in having maybe a chip on your shoulder to some extent, but it can be pernicious. It can be subversive to the ultimate goal, which in science, you can have the imposter syndrome, I think, in athletics and be very justified because it's just objective. This person can run faster, jump higher, or whatever. And so if you don't belong there, it'll be obvious. And so maybe you don't even get to feel the imposter syndrome. But intellectually, it's hard to make the case that it's a beneficial thing rather than what's called a limiting belief that can hold you back. Because when you have that, if you counteract that by, saying, well, no, I'm actually great, I'm the best, that's not good either. So it's the one thing where the antidote to the syndrome or whatever is almost as bad as the syndrome itself. In other words, it's very difficult, Josh, to have a balance between humility and swagger. And I think you need that to be successful. You shouldn't be like, I'm nothing, I have no point, I'm no good. Everyone has a talent, everyone has an ability. And most scientists fail far, far, far more, including Einstein. Einstein was arguably wrong more than he was right. And I always say it's too bad because he could have had a good career. But in reality, you have to make mistakes. As Edison said, greatest inventor of all time, perhaps. He said, I didn't fail 10,000 times. I just found 10,000 different paths to the light bulb filament that didn't work. But these are experiments. And I think if you handicap yourself by saying you're not good enough, you'll never be good, I think that's ultimately self-destructive.
Now, you talk to quite a lot of people and explore quite a lot of topics, and I really enjoy it, that are maybe considered to be a little bit out there or sort of countering the mainstream narrative of physics and science, especially when you're talking to people like, as you mentioned, like Eric Weinstein, Avi Loeb. Eric, who is particularly critical of dogmatic views in science. it makes me think that like you need that confidence in order to be able to sort of stand out on your own and say, no, you're all wrong. So like, how do you go about addressing these issues on your podcast, like openly, as a well-respected scientist, the issues and ideas that may be seen insane, and you definitely lean into it with your podcast titles, which I really love. But like, how do you go about having the confidence to just go for it and say, yeah, well, why not explore these things when perhaps like you might be opening yourself up to ridicule, like not from me, because I'm just an idiot, but like from other scientists.
Yeah, congratulations for basically asking me my own question of how do I go into the impossible, which I don't really feel like I do. On occasion, I have the rarest of all human traits, which is courage. But you're absolutely right, and I take solace in the fact that some of my greatest heroes were both purveyors of the, kind of investigatory phenomena of things that, might not make sense or so forth, but also great champions of what I call, outreach to the public. And I always say, my kind of thing that I've gotten in trouble for lately is saying that I believe scientists have a moral obligation, not just a financial, a fiduciary, but we have a moral obligation to explain things that the public is interested in terms the public can understand. At least in the US and certainly in the UK, every scientist at some level or other was supported by the government, and the government supported by taxes in the West. So in my mind, we have an obligation. I teach at a public college, right? So my customers that pay my salary are entitled to learn things about phenomena that they're interested in terms they can understand. Now, that doesn't mean they can tell me what to research. I do have academic freedom to pursue the research topics. But outside of research, I will be damned if someone's going to tell me that I can't look into some phenomena that happens to be interesting. And what I've had the great fortune to do is to kind of, in America, we say, or in Canada, we'd say, skate where the puck is going, based on my contacts with this great cohort of individuals who've come on my show. In other words, if it wasn't for the podcast, I don't know if I'd be talking to people like Avi Loeb or Eric Weinstein or conventional scientists like the 13 Nobel Prize winners, because it's given me a vehicle to express something that's not part of what we teach to our students in my undergraduate or graduate classes, which is, communicating to the public in terms they can understand, never dumbing it down. My motto on my YouTube channel, Dr. Brian Keating, is always be curious, ABC. And people always point out that scientists are like children in terms of their inquisitiveness. So why wouldn't we be curious about possibilities of other, technologies beyond the Earth? And now what's so interesting, and of course, I'm nowhere near what like Avi Loeb is doing, but in terms of the interest, now we're seeing like NASA get interested in doing that. Very orthodox, scientific, NASA doesn't move, on the latest, hottest trend. And they don't even respond to things like flat Earth, theories. They're not going to bother with that. So the fact that they are now spending a lot of taxpayer money with some of the best scientists in the world investigating this phenomenon, it means that it's somehow acceptable in the mainstream. But I'm pleased to say I've been looking at this for years now, and I'm not alone. Obviously, there are people here long before me, my friend Lex Friedman and Joe Rogan and folks like that have gotten interested in it and brought it to the attention. But where I differ, I'm a university professor, tenured professor, and I'm an author and a research scientist that's co-leading a big collaboration. So there is some more gravitas than a Joe Rogan, as smart or as good as he is, or Lex, who I've been on his show discussing these things. They bring a different perspective. And so from my point of view, I kind of feel like I've been given a platform, and if you don't use your platform, what's the point of having one? So I'm not in either camp. I think I approach it purely scientifically. I give credit where credit's due. I take to task people on both sides of the equation, because I think that's the scientific way to approach it. If you go into a conclusion knowing what your predefined conclusion is going to be, you're not approaching it scientifically. It may be interesting, it may not be wrong, but it's not a scientific way to approach it.
No, I really amused me when I was listening to that conversation that I'd referenced, just because you were talking about a lot of topics or you were given like a lot of reasons for wanting to explore this, and sort of things that made it more credible, that my friends and I would have sat around in university at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, like out of our fucking trees,
Exactly.
and just being like, you know, they arrived just when the nuclear power plant started to appear, and then we were the crazy idiots then, right? But all of a sudden, like these ideas are being discussed by people like yourself, and do you think it's crossed a threshold where it's acceptable to talk about it now that, you know, the New York Times has come out with their papers from, or the releases from the Pentagon, and people like you are discussing it? Have we crossed a threshold where it doesn't seem ridiculous anymore?
I think so. I mean, it's undoubtedly so. What you just said is absolutely correct. And I want to just, highlight you and give you the gold star, A+, for catching the vibe of what the podcast endeavors to do. I always say, in college, you waste your college years because you're fixated on getting the next job or next promotion, getting the A+ or whatever. So you don't really sit there and dwell. But like, what was the most fun about being at university? For me, it was the 3 a.m., hanging out in the dorm with a bunch of friends, some pizza and some drinks, and just like, what the hell is that? What's it all about? What does it all mean? That's the vibe I'm aiming for. A college dorm that you go to, you don't have to pay college tuition, and you can do it with a drink in your hands. Unlike the college students that I teach now, they don't bring drinks to school anymore. Unfortunately, I don't know. Maybe they should, but so that's the exact vibe that we're going for. Now, is it being undoubtedly so? Now, on the other hand, you have to give credit where it's due, right? So one of the people that got the attention in the New York Times was a man by the name of Tom DeLonge, who is a guitarist and musician for Blink-182. And I was, honored or, blessed or, cursed with doing a podcast with Tom DeLonge last year. I was the first person to ever do a podcast with him, live, taking questions. And that was with him and a guy who used to work for the CIA named James Semivan, as well as my friend and fellow podcaster, Kurt Jaimungal, who's in Canada. So we did this massive thing. It's I think it might be my most viewed podcast of all time, for now at least. And that was, really dedicated to what Tom has brought to attention of the media, to the public, and even scientific circles. Now, I take Tom to task. That's my rule. Nobody gets a free pass. No one's going to come on the Into the Impossible podcast spouting dogma and not get challenged. You can spout dogma, but I'm going to push back. I'm always going to do it with respect. Because honestly, I want my colleagues, and friends, obviously, to feel welcome, not pull punches. I'm not doing gotcha 60 minutes style interviews, but we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to push back with respect. So I said to Tom, you claim you have not only evidence for extraterrestrial, craft, but you actually have possession of it. And in that interview, he talks about this material and why it's so and then he admits that there's no complete chain of custody of this material. He says there is, provable, but the provenance cannot be completely established. And okay, so that might work, if you're selling an artifact on eBay or something like that, where people kind of expect to be, maybe buyer beware. But in the media, I said to him, you have to be very careful with that in scientific circles. That doesn't fly. I can't say, I found this meteorite, which, by the way, your listeners, Josh, if they live in the US, I'm sorry, I cannot ship overseas, but I will send a fragment of this meteorite. So here's a meteorite that's 4 billion years old. This is very expensive. I have some dust left over from a bigger sample of it. That's honest to goodness. I will send a sample to people that sign up using their first name and the last name GIST. So they have to use GIST in the sign up list on my email list in America only. briankeating.com/list. I will send you some genuine space dust. Now, if I told you, Josh, I don't know, this was like found, trust me, it came from an alien craft and it's nothing like any material we have on Earth. At least it was until I lost custody. You wouldn't believe such a claim.
No.
The fact is I can trace this meteorite back to proto-solar system origin. I have chemical composition of it, but I'm also not making so grand a claim as namesake of the Cosmos series. Carl Sagan used to say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So he's claiming, Tom DeLonge has claimed on my podcast, he had extraordinary evidence, but made an extraordinary claim, and for which he had non-extraordinary or ordinary evidence for. So I try to hold people, if they're participating in the scientific discussion, to a task. Now, I've also had on fighter pilots and people, that discuss, kind of the veracity of eyewitness accounts. And then I have on skeptics like Mick West, a very famous skeptic who lives in California as well. And I'll take him to task, and we'll talk about, a lot of the criticism that his reproductions as a brilliant, intelligent, but not a scientist. He's a video game designer who created Tony Hawk's, electronic arts game, and he can do amazing stuff. He's good at very kind of low level debunking, and best in the world in some cases. But the higher level requires stuff like Avi's doing, or government secrets. So that's things like Jim Semivan. Now, Jim was on the podcast with Tom DeLonge, and he said there are things, that prevent the government from lying. And, there's no comment that any one of my guests have ever made that has gotten as much controversy as that. So yeah, I'll put that on my playlist so your folks can watch it. But that's a method of, I think, what is needed. We need to debate with love. In other words, I can't say I hate your ideas, Josh, because eventually me hating your ideas will transfer to me hating you. And I don't ever want to have that. I don't get paid to do the podcast. I do it for fun. So if it's not fun, I'll cease to do it. But in that spirit, you have to be open, willing, honest to engage with your debate counterpart and do so with love. And I think through doing so, we can come to truth.
Yeah. I mean, that's a beautiful sentiment, man. So to get down to the brass tacks of it, where does your feeling lie on what we are looking at with this phenomenon? And because for me, I was looking at the Pentagon releasing the videos when they first came out, and I was just like, is this disclosure? Is this it? Have we all just blinked and missed it? Do you expect a big press conference and then the ship comes down and the aliens come out,
Right.
And then I hadn't thought about like what else it could possibly be, and then sort of there's been people reasoning that it could be like military aircraft, it could be like an advertising campaign for new technology, it could be the US government attempting to intimidate China and Russia into just like, look what we got, boys. Where does your feeling lie on what it is? Just roughly.
Yeah. So I always point out, I never say, that belief belongs in these kinds of discussions. For example, I say I have a video, I do solo kind of explainer videos about science, about physics, astronomy, sometimes about unexplained phenomena. I have a video called I Don't Believe in Gravity, and I'm an astrophysicist. So why don't I say I believe in gravity? Well, I don't have to believe in gravity like I believe in Buzz Lightyear or, whatever, or some other, founding myths of America or something like that. No, I don't have to. I have evidence for gravity. It's been tested exquisitely using scientific methods since the time of Galileo. Another finger puppet can come out now. So Galileo took evidence that one of the greatest human beings, scientists, intellects in human history, a man by the name of Aristotle, he had a claim. Aristotle believed that heavy objects like these meteorites will fall faster in gravity than this lightweight sock puppet of Isaac Newton. All right. So what did Galileo do? He went out and did an experiment. No, heavy things don't fall faster than lighter ones. He even did a thought experiment that Aristotle could have done. And then he did an actual experiment allegedly at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. They dispute if that actually happened. Anyway, he didn't have to take on faith that Aristotle was right. He proved him wrong using evidence. So right now, the evidence is inconclusive. And where my friend, and I truly mean that, I don't mean that euphemistically too. Eric Weinstein and I are very good friends. And I've interviewed him many times on my podcast, as well as his brother, Brett, and Brett's wife. And talking about the nature of the evidentiary kind of conclusion that can be drawn at this time. There is no evidence that, to me, is conclusive about these being extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, it could be that the data are not sufficient. That's where Avi comes in. So Avi comes in to collect data from an astronomer. Now, I'm an astronomer, so I can actually collect data. I can actually help, and I was until last month a member of the external advisory committee for Avi Loeb's Galileo project. Eric is a member of the research staff of the Galileo project, so it's very different. I was kind of impartial, auditing, et cetera. And due to time constraints, I stepped away from that. But Avi and I, obviously, you can tell, are very close friends. Now, that role that I have is to say, what are the limits of data? What would be the limits of data? People are talking nowadays, like Elon Musk will tweet out, well, here's how high quality iPhone technology, camera technology has improved exponentially over the last 14 years. And here's the same crappy, grainy, blurry quality of these UFO images, so to speak. So I can speak to that. What does it really mean? And when Eric says something like, show us the data, what is the data? So I actually disagree with him there with respect, as I always say I do. And that's that what an astronomer considers data is very different from what, the lay use of that term means. Like, is eyewitness data? Is that really data? Is a photograph really data? And I make the point using, images that I have here, say in my laboratory. I've got a photographic plate from, before either one of us was born, of a galaxy that's millions of light years away from Earth. Is this data? Well, it's data of a kind, but you can't actually do anything with it. It's just kind of like a pretty picture. On the other hand, here's some data from that object. It's called a spectrum. It's very hard to see if you're watching on video, but trust me, there's a little like a black and white rainbow. This picture shows the chemical fingerprint of the atoms that make up that galaxy, but it can't show certain things like dark matter that we know is in that galaxy. So you have to understand the limits of the word data. So when people say NASA released the data, they don't really understand what the implications of that are, nor are they really in touch with the limitations of what that would produce. For example, Avi is, convinced that this object called Oumuamua with 90% certainty came from another solar system and is not a meteor or comet or nitrogen iceberg or whatever, that it's actually technological in origin. It's extrasolar technology. And because of that, that's an extraordinary claim. So where's the evidence for it? So Avi would like nothing better than say, not only is there evidence for it, data for it, image of it, here's actual spectrum, composition. We went to it. We took a sample. We haven't done that yet. But these are all things that would collect what astronomers would qualify as data. Then a scientist like me, who's not an expert in aliens, can make the scientific method application to those data, to that claim, and assess what is the probability, not only of them being right, but of them being wrong. And that's what most UFO people, who want to believe, and they've got the posters, and they've got the UFO and the big head aliens, I want to believe, that there could be I don't know, but you don't say, I want to have evidence. You go out and collect the evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, hopefully we get more. Yeah, that's all I can.
Yeah,
I'd love the Galileo project to continue to gather more data on that. So, I've got a more philosophical question for you on this kind of topic. Is because anytime I think about this, my head goes right. Okay, so then theoretically, say we make contact, whatever that means, or we find the crashed craft, as the New York Times has somehow said that we have. I don't know. Anyway, they printed it, not me. Like,
right, Tom.
Yeah. But and then it always brings me to this quote that's like kind of attributed to Carl Jung, but I can't find exactly the origin of it. But it's like basically like, beware of unearned wisdom. And do you think we should be trying to steal technology or utilize technology that may be like hundreds or maybe thousands of years beyond what we're capable of doing by ourselves? Like, is that a dangerous road to go down? Like, if we haven't earned it?
Well, I've never heard that, Josh, described as a danger for us to use it. I've heard a danger of us broadcasting our existence in the same way that, that indigenous peoples, shouldn't have notified the, Portuguese explorers of the 1400s that they existed, because it never works out well for them. And as, Stephen Hawking said, you're basically sending them a dinner menu. I actually think that's a little bit overwrought. I've never heard the argument that we shouldn't do it because we might unleash technology, that we can't handle or that could hurt us in some way. It's an interesting thing to consider. Eric Weinstein, again, he has speculated that, one of the biggest reasons that he's interested as a theoretical physicist, Harvard-trained theoretical physicist, is because he wants to see if there truly are limitations on the laws of physics that basically constrain us for all time to be bound to planet Earth by the both vastness of interstellar space and the trivial slowness, ironically, of the speed of light. And so Einstein said that nothing material can travel faster than the speed of light, which is 300,000 kilometers per second. If that's true, that sounds like a fast speed, but I point out just yesterday I tweeted out a tweet that has to do with the farthest object ever made by human beings. This object is, I don't even know how many miles it is. It's such an astronomically large number. It was launched in 1977, Voyager 1. It's now 21 hours away from Earth, traveling at the speed of light. So if you shot a light beam at it, it would take 21 hours to get there and 21 hours to get back, reflecting off of it. And we still communicate with it. It sends a very faint radio signal once a month or a couple times a month back to NASA, and we can still see it. That object was launched 16,467 days ago, and it's less than one light day away, which means this object traveling at 16 kilometers per second, the farthest thing humans have ever made, hasn't even reached one light day. Now, the nearest star is about 1,200 times farther away than where Voyager is. So it would take 1,200 times 40, half a century. So you're talking about like we're talking many, many centuries to get out to where this thing would be, to where the nearest star would be. And there's not even clear evidence that life exists. So what Eric wants to do is short circuit that. What if you could bend it such that, no, you could get 1 light year away in the equivalent of 1 second? He claims that could be possible. And so for that reason, he has a stake in that. Now, I have heard it said a version of what he's talking about, or what you mentioned, which is potential dangers of unlocking technology we're not ready for. And in other words, if someone had given us the keys to the nucleus, as was first unlocked in the 1930s and 40s, leading to the atomic bomb, the fission bomb first, and the fusion bomb second. That unleashed incredible technology. That technology increased incredible destructive power. Now, what if we released that in the 1800s to a man named Alfred Nobel, who invented dynamite? And that creation was also credited with killing millions of people. And he was actually called the Merchant of Death for creating amidst the 345 other patents that he had. That one patent made him the equivalent of Elon Musk of his time. Now, that wouldn't do him no good if you all of a sudden said, here's a neutron and proton, and here's some tritium, and go ahead and make it. He couldn't do anything with it. So I don't think there's a danger to us of having alien technology. I think there could be a danger to us from aliens if they do exist. Although I can't imagine if they are, let's say the speed of light is a limit, that they would have to travel such enormous timescales, even using the most advanced, even if you multiply it by 16,000 times. It still would be, barely enough to reach, to last this 45-year time span and round trip. So anyway, I think it's quite fascinating that we have the ability to detect things out to great distances, and to just now think about the sociological implications is really what you're asking, of an interaction between our limited technology on one hand, although it's the only advanced technology we know exists in the universe. So we should have some pride, again, imposter syndrome. We should balance our swagger of what we've created with the humility that there could be even greater creations lurking out there.
I mean, you made me think of something that was in the book. And you were talking about, I can't remember which chapter it was, but you were discussing the possibility that the Big Bang was not the Big Bang was not just the beginning of everything, that it was possibly the end cycle of the previous universe, and there's like an endless cycle of universes starting and beginning. Do you feel like that is what we should be looking at? Because for me, it seems like I struggle to wrap my head around the concept that there was no beginning and end of anything. Do you know what I mean? Because is your sense that there was like previous universes that sort of collapsed in on themselves after the heat death, and they all go straight out back in, and then like one of those balls that like expands and goes back in again. What do you think? Like, does your scientific brain say, yeah, that's possible? Because my brain says, no, there had to have been a beginning to something.
Yeah, it's the most kind of incomprehensible thing about the universe, as Einstein said, is that it's comprehensible. But now what you're talking about is something called the multiverse, or maybe even its alter form, which is called the cyclic universe or bouncing cosmological model. So where I love to explore is whether or not science can answer the question either way. In other words, first, before you start saying what you prefer or what is most aesthetically pleasing to you, you have to ask the question of, can you actually ascertain if this falls in the purview of science or not? There are things that folks have conjectured about, and I've had lots of conversations with philosophers like David Chalmers, who coined this term called the hard problem of consciousness, to folks like Philip Goff in the UK, Durham, I think, about consciousness as well. And that's whether or not the brain can really be studied within the context of the scientific method. It's the thing that's studying the thing. And so, how does the telescope kind of look back on itself? How does it observe itself? Where does it come from? Is matter necessary before consciousness? All these are scientifically testable within certain limits, but anything outside of that, I think, can fall into the prospects of feasible to be studied by a proper scientific approach. So I don't try to make the conclusion as to what I prefer. I actually don't have preferences. I have preferences for like what type of person my kid should turn out to be, what to have for dinner, where I should go on vacation. I don't really have preferences about science because it's also rich. I call it, and your listeners have, been exposed to so many different guests that you've had on the show. And a lot of times in things like business, you've had a lot of like business leaders, thought leaders, authors, et cetera. Like even with authors, like if you read one of my books, I hope you'll read all of my books someday, your listeners. But if you read one, you're choosing not to, read another book. You're choosing not to watch a cat video on YouTube. You're choosing not to do something healthy, like, drive to the gym. I don't know. So it's all about, attention and how you spend your attention. So for me, I don't really spend my attention thinking about what I could spend, because no matter what the case is, unlike your business guests, like for Apple to succeed, it's not good if Samsung succeeds as much, right? I mean, Apple wants to be a monopoly ultimately, or if Tesla makes a car, they really want to sell all the cars. They don't want to sell, just a little bit more than a rival, right? So in science, it's not like that. It's called an infinite game. The object of the game is to keep playing the game, not to win the game like chess or basketball or cricket. So I think for those reasons, I tend not to ask myself what I prefer, even with these aliens and stuff. Like, would I like it if they were alien? I don't know. I mean, again, it's impossible to know if they exist, first of all, at present, to conclusively say they definitely exist. I don't think anyone who says that is saying it from a scientific evidentiary standpoint. On the other hand, the potential for them to exist does exist. So therefore, it's a kosher, proper study topic that I and my colleagues can and should engage in.
So if you had one area of physics or science, or maybe not even, something that someone said to you, okay, you're going to work 40 years on whatever problem you choose, but I promise you at the end you will have the answer, what would that be?
I guess, it's if it was purely scientific or in the realm of my work, or I mean, for me, it's really, I have, blessed to have children, and, people like Elon Musk or Eric or, people, they talk about time travel, and, that's the thing that they really want. Or space, Elon wants to go to Mars. Eric wants to go beyond the galaxy or the solar system. I don't think about those terms. I think about teleporting. What matters most to me is not my body. It's not my money. I don't want to be buried in a sarcophagus in a pyramid with all my golden treasures or my scientific papers. No, I want to transmit my values, my wisdom, not my knowledge. And to me, I can do that. I just can't be there to witness it. I can go to the future with my values, both through my biological children that I'm blessed to have and my ideological, I don't want to say children, but people that I have been blessed with the honor of mentoring, my graduate students, my undergraduate students. I've mentored 1,000 people in 20 years. And they, I can't say that all of them, came away thinking of me as a mentor. I love the learning that they had from me, but a core did. And those people, like the few children that I am blessed to have, can transmit a little bit of the wonder, the curiosity and maybe some of my wisdom into the future. And I think to ask for more than that is just simply greedy. So for me, I want to know, 100 years, 1,000 years, a billion years, what was my impact? Because it's very difficult, Josh, to measure, did I have an impact? You can have people like, I just saw and I'm not casting aspersions on him. I'd love to have a conversation with Elon, but I just saw his one of his children is estranged themselves. I think they go by them maybe now from Elon. And it just broke my heart, because just a few days ago in America, I don't know what it's like in other countries, but we had Father's Day and he tweeted out how he loves all of his kids so much. And he's really big on population, not having population be limited. He wants to have, growth in human population, not restriction. Mm-hmm. And it just kind of broke my heart as a father, just thinking one of my kids being estranged from me. Even if I got to Mars, even if I won the Nobel Prize, even if it was the richest man on earth, it's not enough. If to me, and I'm sorry, I'm not judging him. Again, I love him. I'd love to talk to him. He's, the person that I'm most fascinated with, outside of my family and but when you think about that, Josh, that would really break my heart. And if you can't really, and I'm not saying either one of them is wrong. I haven't really investigated it. And I hate the fact that I pay attention to TMZ and People but sometimes on Twitter, if you're in the restroom, that's what you're going to do. And certainly he does that in the bathroom as well, as we know. So anyway, my point is I want to know if my values made it to the future, not if my, scientific idea was right or wrong. I guess if I had to answer one scientific question, if I could know the mind of God or Mother Nature or whatever, it would be, was there a single Big Bang or were there multiple Big Bangs? That would be the most interesting question, I think. And that's the one I've chosen to study my scientific career, dedicate my career to.
I've got two questions in my head here. I'll go for the first one. Do you see mortality as a gift or a curse?
Oh, that's a very deep question. Never been asked that question before. I think
it's always a goal of mine.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. And also, I commend you on all the amazing work that you've done and you're doing all this as such a wonderful free service to the public. And I want to congratulate you on your vast success and may it continue. But I often think how do you know you're a good podcaster or not? I'm not just asking you and I'm curious to how you would know it. One way is what you just did or what I just said. I think when someone says, no one's ever asked me that before, that's a grade, right? You don't get there's no professor of podcasts. Maybe I should change my title actually, the professor of podcast. That's kind of cool, doesn't it, Josh? But you don't get a grade, sometimes you did a crappy interview. I've never not published an interview, but there's some that I'm oh man, if I could have a do-over, I would like to do that again. But that's one of them. Another one is if you screwed up the recording and the guest is oh, I'd love to come back on. That's another one. So there are very, very few things like that. But that's just a side note for those of you who are interested in podcasting. How do you know you're doing a good job? It's very hard to know. Other than leave a review of The Gist on Apple Podcasts. Let me do that. And YouTube. And also check out the Into the Impossible podcast on both platforms. Leave a review. And an asterism, a small constellation of 5 stars, no less. Anyway, so meaning from life. Yes, there's a famous book that I quote in the beginning of Losing the Nobel Prize called Denial of Death. And that book is about, by Ernest Becker, famous book about how most of what we do, from building pyramids to putting our names on hospitals to naming podcasts after ourselves and winning a Nobel Prize, these are things done with the abject intention of achieving some form of immortality beyond our physical limitation. I mean, you and I are talking over what would have been considered magic, just 2 decades ago. And as the opening of my podcast always starts with Arthur C. Clarke, again, it's named after his famous words. He said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And we quote his actual voice in the opening of my podcast. Now that is, kind of highlights the fact that, we're obsessed with transcending the physical scientific world, which would mean immortality if you didn't die. So I actually think that, and one last thing that I did ask all my guests is, what do you want to leave as your ethical will when you do die at the biblical age of 120 years old, the age that Moses lived to be, but never got into the promised land. I think that's a very apt metaphor for what scientists, you'll never win science. You'll never, even if you win a Nobel Prize, as I told you, you can still have the imposter syndrome. You can still have barriers to entry to win. But anyway, I think ultimately life has meaning because of the notation and the notion of the passage of time. And we have various clocks by which we measure time, one of which is the biological clock, that you get older, that you don't see people getting younger. And that, I think, is a gift in a certain sense. The ultimate expression of that book, Denial of Death, is to make life worth living. Now, would I want, I would like, I take vaccines and, and I use medications, all legal, of course. But yeah, I would like to live as long as possible. But maybe I only feel that way because, I've lived knowing that I'm going to die someday and knowing that you don't know when that day is. In fact, I quote from the Talmud. I'm Jewish and I do quote a lot, but not in a proselytizing way. But I think there's some wisdom. And one of the pieces of wisdom is like repent the day before you die. Make your peace the day before you die. Let's say you don't like repent because you're atheist. Fine. You make your peace with how you live, with whatever value system you have. And everybody has a value system. Day before you die. I don't know when I'm going to die. Yeah, that's exactly the point. You could die tomorrow. You could literally die tomorrow. And would you want to be doing what you're doing right now? That's what you have to ask yourself. And that's, that's a very sobering thing. But if you didn't die, I think yes, you would miss out on some of the existential meaning of life. But that said, I'm working as hard as possible, on my health, and hopefully some smart listeners out there will invent what one of my kids calls the never dying pill and win a Nobel Prize for that.
Would you take it?
Yes. So a very famous scientist, Richard Feynman, said, if you ask a lay person, do you want to live forever? Most of them will say, no, all my friends will all die and stuff like that. I'd like to be greedy and like give it to everyone I love. But he said a scientist will always answer, yeah, because I want to live forever because I want to see the cool science and all the discoveries that come. And ironically, he didn't live that long. He died, I think, before his 80th birthday. And he was an amazing, but his influence lives on ideologically, literally on millions of people around the world. Yeah,
his YouTube videos are very famous for learning. That got me through my university exams with my 2 weeks of cramming.
Exactly. And he didn't even, YouTube, the internet didn't exist when he died. The internet did not exist in 1989.
Just wild. Yeah, I'm of that generation that really struggles to picture what life would have been like. I physically can't imagine it. It's such a weird thing. Like you can get Wi-Fi with whatever country you're in now. It's not like going on holiday like separates you from that even anymore. It's like I actually have no sense of what that would be like. It's really strange.
No, I know.
I mean, the grass is always greener syndrome tells me, it'd be way better. But I've just no idea. So speaking of this, the idea of perhaps like taking your consciousness and like transforming it and taking it into the world of AI and like taking your brain and putting it in a computer. Like I often wonder about whether that's actually physically possible, because it kind of it hinges on the idea that the consciousness or like the soul or whatever it is that gives us sentience can be measured. And if it can be measured, then theoretically it could be stored, but then maybe not even. Like, do you think that consciousness is something that can be measured at all? Like, is there something there that we can put like parameters on and say, well, yes, you have got to, I don't even know what the units of measurement would be, but
yeah, it's certainly a topic I've talked a lot about, as I said, with Phil Goff and David Chalmers. He did part of the interview wearing a virtual reality headset. He's very much in favor of something called like the simulation hypothesis, kind of like the Matrix movies. So I don't. I personally think that consciousness can be studied. It isn't maybe as entirely studyable as you could say study the nervous system of an African toad. In other words, it's not really subject in the same ways to the experimental version of the scientific method, where you're like, you examine something that has no consciousness, that is in every other way controlled to be identical to consciousness like us. Then there are people that believe that inanimate objects participate in consciousness, like electrons, and in fact, that's the title of my podcast with Philip Goff. Are electrons conscious, or they are conscious? The other one with Chalmers is like the Matrix was a documentary. So I like to be provocative in the title, but the notion that consciousness is somehow outside of it is not really an acceptable kind of notion for me. Now, that being said, how quantitative can you be studying consciousness? I think it's very hard. Past guest Sir Roger Penrose and his colleague Stuart Hameroff, they believe that you can study consciousness. For example, one vector towards understanding it is through the unconscious state that Dr. Stuart Hameroff induces in his anesthesiology patients before he operates or whatever. So he controls consciousness. Now, he augments that with a theory of quantum mechanics that can participate in consciousness. So that's when things start to break down in my mind. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're wrong, but you can then start to pick apart those arguments and subject them to the scientific method, which also ultimately has to involve the consensus of the community, not for the authority of numbers like, 97% of scientists agree that consciousness is in the microtubules. No, I don't mean that. I don't mean just like they believe you, because belief is not part of the scientific method, but rather that they agree that your methodology is replicable, that you can be falsified, not just proven, and all sorts of other criteria and hurdles that have to be passed. So I believe it's an acceptable, kosher part of the scientific endeavor. I just don't know to what extent fruitful quantitative analyses can be built, but that could be mostly because of my ignorance on the subject. On the other hand, I think I can speculate, as well as David Chalmers, who's an expert, on the actual consciousness at a gut level, philosophical level. We can talk about things like what would be the implications of the Matrix as reality if we are simulated, or Donald Hoffman, who was on my podcast last year, who believes that consciousness is basically an evolutionary, guise to help us cope with the gigabytes of information that come in every second. And basically, there's no reality to our consciousness. So I do believe I am just as capable. You might just be just as capable, because I don't think there's experiments or, methodologies or tools that need come into play. So for those reasons, I think it's worth studying. It's interesting. I think sometimes the claims of, electrons in my coffee cup, my vodka bottle here are conscious. I think those are overblown, but they're fun to speculate on. And so I will engage and indulge in that. And many occasions I have.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I go back and forth on the idea that like places and buildings and inanimate objects can be conscious and or have a feeling or a vibe, or I don't know, that they can engender the atmosphere that was around them, and then I used to run an après ski bar in Austria, and I walk into that place and it's just magic, and it feels like there's magic in the wood that they built it from. And then I'm just like, well, yeah, this bar is totally conscious. Like, there's a video of me lying on the bar on the last day of one of my seasons, like stroking the bar, being like, I'm coming back, baby, it's okay. Like, so, I go back and forth on this idea. But if also a guest suggestion perhaps for yourself would be Dr. Mark Solms, who wrote a book about, the origin of consciousness in the brain and sort of where it came from. The guy's book blew my mind, and it was somewhat over my head. So maybe you could have like a more intelligent discussion with him than I managed. So if the universe is a simulation, does that mean God is a programmer?
Yeah, people have said that, and then then I'll always push back with respect and say, well, that sounds an awful lot like God. And 99% of the people that profess such a thing are atheists, which is fine. I don't proselytize, I said, and I accept all voices, except if people are militantly attacking something. That's no fun to talk to. But on the other hand, I think it's a perfectly interesting and acceptable hypothesis. what might be most, acceptable about it is that it can maybe immediately be proven wrong, or immediately there could be data presupposed or scientific limits on it. For example, you could say, well, what would be the information requirement to replicate all levels of experience just of human beings? Forget about simulating, the ice inside of a crater on the North Pole of the moon, and simulating just what human beings experience. And then often they'll say, well, you can't tell me that you exist different, from a brain in a jar, which is the old Descartes, kind of cogito ergo sum argument. I think, therefore I am. So these arguments are very old. And of course, Descartes got out of it by saying God is good. I can envision goodness. I can envision maximal goodness. God is that maximal goodness. And for him to simulate these experiences of thinking would mean that he is not good, because these experiences aren't real. And therefore, good God wouldn't do that. Therefore, I exist. So because I think. And so that was his. I don't believe that, because what if you don't believe there's a God, or what if God doesn't exist? You can't prove that God exists. I readily admit that. So no, but I think then you can start getting into this discussion. Well, what would be the ethics and morality of a world with a simulated, an existence that is simulated by some master simulator? Would they be able to pull the plug? Would that be ethical? Would you be able to knowingly cause pain? You now have all these godlike, and then you have to say, well, what is pain? What is suffering? How do you make a computer suffer? But even beyond that, the data requirements, and usually it's just an extrapolation based on Moore's law, where they conveniently neglect the fact that computing power may grow intrinsically double every 18 months, but the utilization of that power is saturating at a constant level. It's not growing at an exponential level, because the more powerful the computer gets, the more people want to use it. It's like Facebook, needs to run on ever more powerful computers. It doesn't make it more powerful. It just means there's more people using it, which saps the resources that already exist. So it's not gotten any more powerful than it was a decade ago in 5 doubling cycles. It's just basically still reminding you of some annoying friend that you met a long time ago when her birthday is. And that I always use Facebook to remind myself to unfriend people that I have no relationship with and regret ever accepting their. That's basically all I use it for nowadays, unfortunately. Unlike my Twitter and my podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I ditched Instagram and Facebook on my fuck Mark Zuckerberg campaign.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, I haven't yet successfully ditched Twitter, unfortunately. I'm interested to see what Elon's going to do, because I mean, if he does the things he says he's going to do, I think it could be really good. But whether that's actually what happens is going to be another question.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the last thing that I would like to ask you about, since you've kind of gone and scuppered one of my other questions about, being, I was going to ask, is God at the base of physics? But you've said you can't prove that, so we'll move on to something a little different. Is one of the things that really made me interested in physics in the first place was a video I saw when I was in university, again at 3 a.m. About the double-slit experiment. And I've been wondering about the implications of it since I saw the video. And I mean, I don't think you're going to be able to tell me exactly what it means, because I don't think anyone can. Yeah. But you can give it a go. So to me, and this may be just my really poor understanding of it, it made me wonder if the universe is not there when it's not being observed. If I am not looking at something, or if nothing is looking at something, does that mean it's just sort of not there in a wishy-washy sense?
So the double-slit experiment is, of course, this observation in the early 1900s that if you were to take an electron and fire it through 2 slits in an opaque screen, that you would get this pattern. You'd get this pattern that you would not expect to be embodied in the physical world if the electron, in some sense, doesn't go through both slits at once. And you could actually prove that it does or does not do that. And so it's really not too far off from what you described, which is this notion of, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound, right? I mean, it's not that dissimilar from as you phrased it, kind of like just a few minutes ago. So it's kind of a quantum version of that argument. Now, that was the argument that Galileo first really popularized in the 1600s, which was, basically, is consciousness, is the, kind of the observer responsible for the observance of a physical phenomenon, or do the physical phenomena exist independent of the observer? Because, as I said, you can choose to block off one of the two slits and you'll get a different pattern than is actually observed when you don't close off one of the two avenues for the electron to travel in. So it's kind of weird. We kind of anticipate waves will do that. Even light will do that. But an electron, we envision it as a tiny little, it's an elementary particle. You can't subdivide it. In some sense, it sometimes behaves like a little billiard ball. So how can it go through both paths at once, through two doors at once? And so it is a great mystery. And to counteract that mystery, physicists go to all sorts of gymnastics, including, Josh, the invocation of parallel universes. And I have a conversation with Sean Carroll about that on my podcast for his book, Many Worlds in One, I think it's called. And so I refer folks to that on my YouTube channel, Dr. Brian Keating, or on the podcast if you can dig it up. And these are some of the most interesting questions. Again, that question is not an academic one. In fact, it's related tangentially to my search for the origin of the universe, if it was a single Big Bang, or if there are not only multiple instantiations of our universe, but what if there are multiple universes existing in physical space, but separated by such vast distances that we can't access them? That's another version of what's called the multiverse. So these things, the ever-ready high quantum mechanics, rose in response to the double slit, in which the electron does in one universe go through the left slit, other universe goes through the right slit, and in that sense can be made self-consistent with our notions of what reality means, but at the expense of adding at least one universe every time an electron does that.
Yeah, I don't know how you get the storage space. And it kind of, if that's the answer, it kind of feels like it doesn't chime with the idea that they are so far away from each other that we couldn't possibly traverse those distances. Because if we're seeing the results of two parallel universes in one played out here, it suggests that they're like pressed right up against each other in the most weird, like fourth dimensional way that I can't really wrap my head around. But
well, you're not alone there, Josh. Many people can't as well.
Okay, so then for one absolutely very fast question, aside from your own books, what is the book that you would most recommend people should read, to either just fiction or anything, or just for a grasp of science?
So Roger Rose's books actually were the first real popular science books that I ever read. There's one that involves quantum mechanics, cosmology, the brain, and that's called The Emperor's New Mind. And I have a video up about that on my podcast as well, where I was really delighted as a young kid to read that book. It's the first book I ever read that was written in a popular science audience. And then for my first book, Sir Roger wrote the blurb on the back of it, and then later went on to win the Nobel Prize, probably because he endorsed my book. No, I'm just kidding. We have no idea. That had nothing to do with it.
Well,
although I do talk about women and how few women have won the Nobel Prize. And in 2018, when the book came out, since then, the number of women has doubled from 2 to 4. So I take all. No, I'm just kidding. I don't take any credit.
Well. So your books have magical powers. That's what you're telling us.
Exactly. Yes. So it affects not only if you read them, it affects them just when you buy the book. That's all you need to do.
Exactly.
And then a dollar bill falls in the forest, and I pick it up, and my kids can go to college.
Well,
thank you, Josh.
No problem. Brian, I really want to thank you for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating and a lot of fun. So thank you so much, man. Links for everything that we've talked about, I'll put in the description below. And for your mailing list to get some free space dust, that's 100% verifiable, not Tom DeLonge style, not like that fake Da Vinci. I think it's a Da Vinci that was there's the Netflix documentary about all the fake artwork. Nothing like that. It's real, 100% stuff.
Verified, right? Not like buying a star. It's actually real. People care about it.
I can't believe someone's making money on that. Selling
I know.
stars.
But it gave me an idea. I now have the instead of the International Star Registry, I have the International Universe Registry as part of the multiverse. So I can sell you not a star. I don't care. I can sell you an entire universe. Join my mailing list, briankeating.com/list, and you could sign up for your very own universe.
Does someone have C137 already?
I'll take that. That's the gist universe.
No, that's
Thank
the Rick
you,
and
Josh.
Morty universe.
Oh,
C137.
that's
What the Rickest Rick is from. But yeah,
very good.
Thanks very much, man. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you too.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the podcast. If you want to leave us a comment, that would be awesome. Please like, share, subscribe, and if you're listening on Apple, please leave us a review. Until next time, thanks for listening.